Good evening, everyone. It's very nice to see you all. My name is Khanna, and I'm the director of the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event this evening, which the Franklin Humanities Institute has organized in conjunction with the NASHA. I want to thank Sarah Schroth for encouraging this collaboration, Trevor Schoonmaker for providing the occasion for us to be able to see Akomfrah's work, Jessica Rule, Wendy Hauer, Donna Orr, Eric Barstow, and Sarah Rogers for their help putting everything together. We have organized this panel about the John Akomfrah NASHA commissioned installation Precarity. The installation was first shown at Prospect 4, the New Orleans City Triennial Art event, which was curated by NASHA's Trevor Schoonmaker this year. Hopefully most of you have seen the installation, but there is a chance to see it again tonight. It will be, it's on a loop, but it will be restarted at 8 p.m. and will be on a loop until September the 2nd. Perhaps it sleeps at night, I hope. I would have thought. It's a very impressive piece of work based around the life of Buddy Bolden, the musician we would come to know as one of the originators of jazz. And the installation in characteristic Akomfrah style addresses the archival fragment and how to make sense of a quickly disappearing past that has been recorded only in fading or dissolving fragments. The story of Bolden's life, his historical significance, and his mental health are all presented here as precarious. And in some ways, this is a piece that visualizes aspects of Michael Ondaatje's fragmented novel, Coming Through Slaughter, Slaughter referring to the town just before Jackson, where the Louisiana State Mental Asylum is, which equally improvises a life available, the novel that is, equally improvises a life available only in fragments and a fading photograph. Water, as you have seen, flows through the work on Bolden, both as a feature of New Orleans, a motif, and of course the activity of coming through water along the Mississippi to New Orleans, the waterway that made the city the site for being sold down the river as slaves. The mental asylum, I might just add, was not on the water, in fact, built away from it to avoid the mosquitoes that plagued the one in New Orleans itself. Yet Ondaatje's title, Coming Through Slaughter, makes one think, or me think, coming through water, and the legacy of early transport of slaves down the Mississippi. Current Franklin Humanities Institute Humanities Labs, social movements, social practice from slavery to freedom, health humanities, and the Digital Humanities Initiative all touch on the themes of Akomfrah's work, as does our Franklin Humanities Institute 2018 to 2019 annual theme on water, in which we will be exploring many aspects of humanistic and artistic responses to water, from oceanic voyages to lives built around rivers, from aquatic aesthetics to refugee migration, from water shortage to floods, fluidity to flow, and from water conceived through sacred forms to aquatic life worlds and ontologies. So FHI has organized this event with local colleagues who have written on and taught about different aspects of humanistic thought that touch the themes and aesthetics of precarity. I think that we'll just go in alphabetical order. They're not sitting in alphabetical order, but we don't have to go in alphabetical order, but let's just go in alphabetical order. Our speakers tonight, and I'll introduce them all at the beginning, are Laurent Dubois, Professor of Romance Studies and History, and he's the Faculty Director of the Forum for Scholars and Publics at Duke. Michael Hart, who's Professor of Literature and Co-Director of the Franklin Humanities Institute Social Movements Lab. Deborah Jensen, Professor of Romance Studies and Co-Director of the Franklin Humanities Institute Health Humanities Lab. Shambhavi Kaul, who's Assistant Professor of the Practice of Filmmaking, Art History and Visual Studies. Pedro Lash, who's Associate Research Professor of Art History and Visual Studies and Director of the Social Practice Lab. And Mark Anthony Neal, who is James B. Duke Professor and Chair of African and African American Studies, Director of the Duke Council on Race and Ethnicity, and the host of Left of Black, for which he conducted a really marvelous interview with John Akomfrah about this piece, which you can search and find it on the web. Maybe he'll talk about that. So, okay, we'll move through in alphabetical order. So, Laurent, why don't you start?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me and for all welcome here tonight. I'll start us off with a few thoughts that do connect actually with Michael Ondaatje's work, Coming to the Slaughter, which I went back to after seeing the piece, and also was traveling to New Orleans actually last week. So both of those kind of informed the thoughts I had. And it's just a marvelous piece, and I do want to thank you, Trevor, for having brought it to us and allowed us to see it here. So I'm going to use a couple of quotes from Ondaatje. The first comes about near the end of the novel. And this was actually Ondaatje's first novel, so the movement that he from poetry to kind of prose in this novel is kind of interesting. It's published in 1976, so quite an early experimental work. Near the end, Ondaatje in his own voice writes, "There is a complete absence of him. Even his skeleton is softened, disintegrated, and been lost in the water under the Holtz Cemetery." So I think that the absence of Bolden, the silence surrounding him, has always drawn people to him, right? So it's precisely the fact that there's this really fragmented, thin archive that makes it kind of possible to produce all this work about him. The example of the one photograph of Buddy Bolden, which is actually remarkable. I ended up reading all these articles including in a publication called The Jazz Archivist, about this one photograph of Bolden, which is curious because when you look at it, it was actually found in 1939, the photograph, published at that time, has since been lost, so there is no original. And people have been debating whether it was published the wrong way, like whether it was reversed when it was published. And either way you reverse it, it turns out there seems to be 3 left-handed musicians out of 6 in the band, which seems very unlikely. There's a theory, one theory is that actually the photograph might have been taken at 2 different moments. The lighting on 2 sides is different. So there's just this one photograph kind of generates almost this infinite debate, and it's really, really interesting. And just the question of how Bolden is holding his cornet in that image and why. So that's just one example. But other than that, you have these photographs, you have a couple of other areas. Now it's obviously in the piece, the way in which Akomfrah kind of puts the archive underwater, right? It's very profound. You've all noticed that if you've seen it. And the way in which that kind of is a meditation on this archive that is, of course, expanded. The way in which the archive's always kind of opaque and changeable and underneath in a certain way. I think that's very powerful. It's the narratives about Bolden that were later told, and this is something that Gwen Tompkins, who hosts an NPR show on music in New Orleans, kind of insisted to me when I talked to her about this, that everyone had different opinions of Bolden, but no one was able to find someone before Bolden that they would kind of attribute sort of some of the beginnings. So there's kind of interesting way in which he became a founder, maybe through those stories. Now, Ondaatje writes at one point, and there are no recordings of Bolden, as famously, but Ondaatje writes at one point, "It is good you never heard him play on recordings. If you never heard him play someplace where the weather, for instance, could change the next series of notes, then you should never have heard him at all." This idea that unless you heard it kind of in the space, along maybe outdoors, in the air, near the water, you would not have possibly heard him. But Precarity, I think, is possible because it places so strongly in a rich world of sound, right? So actually, it's this very lush sonic landscape. So rather than not hearing Bolden, we don't hear Bolden exactly, but we hear all these sounds. And the sound engineering in the piece is really remarkable. And I think, in a sense, the piece shows us that the archive is everywhere, right? That the archive is in buildings, it's in the space of New Orleans itself, it's in all this music that's been produced. So that's a sense of being kind of actually surrounded by information about Bolden, in a sense, or about the world in which he lived. And I like that kind of play in the work. Of course, Bolden's story, I think, can stand in a way, as it does in the piece, for the broader history of Afro-Atlantic culture and music, which is a space, of course, in which a foundational moment of exile, silencing, erasure is the basis for an ever-changing and fulsome space of performance and meaning across time. And the piece and Bolden's story, I think, also reminds us of the ways in which gaps and silences, like spaces on the page in poetry or moments of silence in jazz, are also actually the basis for much of the joy and wonder of historical narrative and reconstruction, right? We need the absences in order to do what we do. I'll just end with this final quote that kind of speaks to that in Ondaatje's book. And this is kind of in the voice of Bolden, one of the places where he writes in that voice. "When I played in parades, we would be going down Canal Street, and at each intersection, people would hear just the fragment I happened to be playing, and it would fade as I went further down Canal. They would not be there to hear the end of phrases. I wanted them to be able to come in where they pleased and leave when they pleased, and somehow hear the germs of the start and all the possible endings at whatever point the music I had reached then. The right ending is a door you can't see too far out of." Thanks.
I was still thinking. So I wanted to just work through three concepts and try to link them into the film: precarity, vulnerability, interdependence. So I want to start with, in my mind, there are two primary streams of thinking about or theorizing precarity in recent decades. One having to do with labor, and the other a more existential or social mode of thinking precarity. The labor mode way of thinking precarity is maybe the more easily explainable one. In countries in which there had been populations with guaranteed contracts and regular dependable work, precarity is a way of designating, since the 1990s, since the onset of neoliberal policies, the kinds of work that is not guaranteed, so that workers, precarious workers, have to find many different jobs during a lifetime, often have to work many jobs at the same time. So the lack of the guaranteed employment and of a regular contract. Now, of course, that charge, that protest, that work is now precarious, only works in certain dominant countries, because in many countries there was never a guaranteed employment, and then also within the dominant countries, only within limited populations. But it does seem like, and it has functioned as a useful rallying cry and charge against the economic transformations. It also, of course, destroys the traditional modes of labor organizing because of not having sustained and reliable employment. So then there's a second mode in which scholars and activists have used the word precarity, the term precarity, in recent years, and that has, I was calling it an existential or social conception of precarity. In some ways, broader than the precarious labor that I was just referring to. Here's an explanation from Judith Butler, who I think uses it in this way. She says that precarity names politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from a failing social and economic networks of support more than others and become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. And I guess there's two aspects of that I wanted. Certain populations, so that certain populations, she's thinking primarily of people of color, of the disabled, of those subordinated by gender hierarchies. So certain populations suffer more than others, and that is politically induced. So again, it dovetails in some ways with the critique of the changes, the economic changes that make workers precarious. This is the removal of welfare structures, the removal of social structures that have, in the past, in some countries, among certain populations, sustained life. Obviously, like I said, labor is part of that mix, but in some ways, this existential or social notion is broader. Right. Okay. In both of these, it seems to me that the term precarity so far is used really as a mode of protest and a recognition of vulnerability. So in the film, so I'm trying to make sense of the title of the film. That's what I'm doing. So it's certainly in the film. We do have, in a minor way, this question about labor precarity. I think it's the penultimate section we have. I believe there are only white workers in the factory, and then much longer scenes of black workers in the fields, and a clear recognition there of the precarity of those at work, like the vulnerability of workers. Maybe that's the way of saying it. But we also have in the film, and maybe predominantly, what I was calling just a moment ago, the existential social notion of precarity. The way that illness, blackness, especially function in the film as a making vulnerable of certain populations by a politically induced condition. Now I'm going back to that. So it seems to me that in some ways that this is how I'm understanding in the way the use of the term precarity for naming as an adequate name for for the action of the film. In fact, in the film, it's intensified. This is my understanding, and I think some of you who are more aesthetically inclined than I would be able to speak to this better. But it's intensified in the film it seems to me, by the luxuriant and lyrical quality of the film that's continually in contrast with the vulnerable, precarious existence that's being depicted. And that contrast between the lyrical, luxuriant character of it and the precarity seems to me even heightened it. There's one last thing in my time that I wanted to come to, which is that, and this is really a question I have for the film that I can't answer. I'm sort of hoping that someone else can, or maybe I'm asking too much of it. It seems to me in the politically engaged discourses of precarity, it's not merely used as a concept of protest and about vulnerability. Instead, in some ways, the precarious are recognized as being in a privileged position. Because the precarious are not only victims, the precarious are, of course, victims. I don't mean to say that. They are not only victims, though, they also have a form of strength. And the logic goes something like this: the precarity reveals a vulnerability that is not only theirs, and that that vulnerability can be transformed into a kind of interdependence. And that's how the movement towards seeing precarity as a position of strength or power comes through that. So just as an example of this, what it might look like in action, it seems to me that the most inspiring social movements of the recent decades all might be understood as, or characterized by, moments when the precarious assemble. So I think that this moment of transforming precarity into a strength has to come through not only a recognition of interdependence in a kind of static way, but actually a construction or a constitution of that through the assembly. And so here's just 4 examples maybe of some of the more inspiring movements of the last several years that it seemed to me are characterized by that, by the populations. They're assembling as precarious, but it's not just a protest of their condition, but actually a construction of something new. So I was putting together here the Gezi Park protests, 2013 in Istanbul, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests of the Dakota Sioux. And so here, the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, it's not only about the vulnerability of the populations, it's also recognizing the precarity of the earth, of our relationship to the earth, but at the same time, by gathering, by the assembly of it, it's proposing a different kind of interdependence. That's what I mean by the strength. Think of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests. Black Lives Matter certainly too ought to be posed in this context. It's not only a matter of a protest against our vulnerability, but rather a construction of a new strength through interdependence. See, that's what I want from all this. My last one was Ni Una Menos, movements against sexual violence that start in Argentina and transfer through other parts of Latin America. I don't need to really give that. But in all of this, what I wanted to point towards, how in these social movements, vulnerability is transformed into a power through not only a recognition of our interdependence, but through acting on that, through a constitution or a construction of institutions of our interdependence. So, okay, if you got that, that's what I wanted to ask the film. So if the film is about precarity, and maybe about precarity in different ways, is there a way that it's not only, and I think that it is, but I can't formulate it myself, that it's not only a matter of protest about the vulnerability of the central character of the populations in some ways named by it, but rather also projecting or creating a collective form of interdependence and strength like the ones that I'm naming in these social movements. That's where I'm stopping.
I'm glad I come after Michael in the alphabet because I'll be talking about some of the same things, but in a different way. So I want to test out a word with you, boldened, and wonder if any of you felt sort of metaphorically boldened in watching this installation about Buddy Bolden. Anyone? No? Didn't come to your mind? Because I had that impression very strongly, and I've learned that there is a play that was done in the past called Emboldened about Buddy Bolden, and it seems to me that that sort of counter-precarity is really there that you're discussing. So when I first walked into the installation room, I thought that I would be talking about the relationship of 19th and 20th century Afro-diasporic cultural expression, preservation, and transmission in its sheer precarity to the legacies of Afro-diasporic crossings of oceans and rivers, to the perilous bodies of water and spirits of water. So in other words, the problem of the crossing from Africa as sort of a legacy that then is compounded around the lack of registered and transcribed voices, no matter how brilliant, over the first century of presence in the New World. And but instead, I found that right away I was just blown away by a different kind of pleasure of the spectator and reading experience with this very complex composition. And so instead, I will be talking today about the unexpected euphoria of a neurodiverse visual staging, of the phenomenological, sensory, and cognitive joy of being untethered from the conventional alignment of narrative, medium, and technology to unified perspective. The construction of perspective in the arts and sciences of the Western Renaissance was beautifully trained to the dictates of the human primate's visuo-cognitive apparatus. And that only consolidated the tendency of the human machine to see the world in a certain way. Art, science, and technology train the Western gaze to seek and find that centered, linear view, not just in the world, but in our world-making and our world impositions, which are so present in this installation. John Akomfrah uses perspective very precisely, very creatively, in the tableau vivant of each different video screen. But in the choreography of our visual, spatial, and auditory encounter with the divergences and the multiplicity of these centered scenes, we also encounter a world from which we are normally barred access by our neurotypicality, by our normalcy. We see this thoroughly disordered mind in a way that can be ecstatic throughout the film at different moments, as well as violent. So the story that Akomfrah tells through this incredibly complex composition could perhaps be critiqued for idealism, and that he spares us all the worst of the jazz player's anguish and violence. Many of you probably saw the article, news article about how he had mauled his mother, and the word maul, I think, expresses the degradation that he and his loved ones experienced, and we sense that anguish and violence. But what Akomfrah gives us, instead of a kind of abject madness, a madness that is aligned with the negative sense of precarity, is a jazz-like form in which the lost recordings are somehow mimed, and hallucinations and obsessions unfold as a poem and give us options in the choices that we have to make about how we align these different frames and these 6 different sections and the double consciousness quote and all of the authors that we associate with theories of double consciousness in the African American experience around this sort of gentle introduction to his its madness. So mental illnesses are usually, I think, dismissed to the attic of human curiosity precisely through the label mental illnesses, because it's a total abstraction. It simply divides one form of alienation and biological distress and suffering from all of the others. Because mentality, when we really think about what we know about mind, it's clear that it's deeply embodied. And this is an installation in which the whole vocabulary is deeply embodied. So it puts the viewer into almost a kind of trance state in which precarity is lifted, because each object, even if it is the only one on Earth, like the main character, the problem, Buddy Bolden, who describes himself in the first couple of sections as the only thing on Earth and then as the only object on Earth. But each object, even if it were the only one on Earth, has endless metamorphic ontogeny and phylogeny. Each object is at once its opposite and its antecedent, its missing match and its triplets, or its quadruplets, as in the one scene where it's 4 screens. That multiplicity of the metamorphic object in itself is sort of signals to us that the precarity as we sense it in social existence, as the anxiety of will there be enough, will there be continuously enough, is alienated in the doubling of our own sensory apparatus and perception and reception, as if we were more than me. So in Akomfrah's Precarity, property is not a subject of precarity, property is theft, and it's stolen away by sensory, motor, and cognitive encounter, unfolding as if we were more than one spectator, reader, subject of many stories. So I began sort of just writing fragments of poetry as I watched it, and here's one of them. Precarity is lifted through a sensory integration and travel like the dead. Straitjackets merely an experiential device that looks sexy on a starfish. Carnival, we hunger for the seaweed of mica brilliance, sliding tactile in the glide, lift, and stamp of feet. We are prisoners in Plato's cave before not just one screen, but 2, 3 liberates as eyes and ears swivel in unison. We trust the illusion. And I will stop
there. I want to start by just saying thank you to Ranji for organizing this interdisciplinary panel. I'm the filmmaker on the panel. So I'll read what I've written. Cinematic time and space are popularly articulated as a string of formulaic shots. Long shots, wide shots, medium shots, close-ups, extreme close-ups, etc. These shots must be joined together to make up cinema. At first, protagonists in popular cinema are just body parts, scattered amongst these various shots. It's only when these scattered parts are reconstituted through specific editing strategies that a protagonist may be produced. The proper protagonist, the one who is up to the task of moving the narrative forward, and the one who is, at least eventually, in control of the plot. So my question, what are the means available to produce protagonists inside cinema that experience time and space as unstable or disorienting? Or who, when they come upon the plot, are horrified to find that they are in excess of it? So as one of the artists, a filmmaker on this interdisciplinary panel, I would start by saying I have no expertise to offer on the remarkable work of John Akomfrah, beyond my own preoccupations with cinema. When he was here in April, he gave an artist talk, and I recall I heard him say about cinematic images that they have utopian promise. Elsewhere, I read more about this with relation to the future possibilities of archival images, because while they may have existed one way, they can exist again in another way. As I watched Precarity, however, I was drawn to another kind of utopian promise, one I've always assumed to be the main project of cinema, to realize the human ahead of the self. In Precarity, much like improvised music, there's no strict adherence to the plot. By popular cinema standards, the narrative progresses inefficiently. Too much is included and too much is left out. Buddy Bolden is a precarious type of protagonist in his own biopic. Having barely left a verifiable trace, he simply recedes into fiction. But he won't be reduced to the father of jazz. There's either too much or not enough narrative chronology to plot such a point. In conventional cinematic construction, wide shots, sometimes called establishing shots, appear at the beginning of an edited sequence. They are used to provide an overview before the narrative progresses forward. In Precarity, this type of shot appears as stillness, in the form of elaborately costumed and staged tableaus. Rather than make clearly viewable, a fixable moment of the past, these tableaus engage in establishing and re-establishing unstable past moments that are in relation to a future that is yet to unfold. Close-ups in popular cinema have at times been imagined as shots that offer access to the inner workings of the protagonist's mind. In Precarity, the medium close-up is instead recast as a highly stylized portrait, where the face is not so open to interpretation. Rather, the backdrops loom large, the ruins of New Orleans that could be of the past or the present day, and similarly, a timeless and ruined mental institution. No matter if Buddy Bolden is seen in a beautiful suit or a straitjacket, he appears in medium close-ups, rendered as a portrait. The interplay of these theatrical tableaus and portraits in Precarity is multiplied into 3 screens. If cinema's singular screen secures the linear temporal progression that in turn makes possible a cohesive plot, as Precarity progresses in 3 parts, it invites an immersive, contemplative viewing, as in the art historical triptych. 3 screens also produce an incohesive plot, one that cannot be fully encompassed, and one that will replay differently through repeated and looped viewings. Buddy Bolden, the protagonist, is also produced as a double and triple, repeating but not exactly, adjusting and changing, as if he was revising and improvising upon himself. These repetitions do add up, however, and perhaps what we encounter is a more radical kind of reconstituted body, not popular cinema's version that is pressed in service of a commonly understood plot, but rather one that pushes against a single plot precisely because it is multiple. Perhaps then what emerges is more phantom-like than protagonist, which makes me consider the way this work has been thought of as a ghost story. New Orleans, as the present-day backdrop for this historical tale, appears as ghostly. Wide shots depict factories along its skyline as Bolden looks on. These are no longer the bustling factories of the turn of the last century. Instead, they seem to have fallen silent, spent and irrelevant in a New Orleans now depicted as evacuated of people, haunted by lurking ghosts, and by the ocean that weighs on heavily from overhead. It is a strange kind of sight, its geolocation being below, under the water that permeates the whole installation from the first shot to the last. If W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington are the dueling narrators of this tale, in Precarity the ocean appears as the violent force that shapes it. The ocean itself, shapeless, shadowy, and transparent, and historically the site of so much seen and unseen violence against the enslaved and migrants. We watch as the ocean washes over documents and photographs, either developing them or ruining them. We hear the blues mixed into the ocean until it sounds as if the ocean is literally carrying this music to us. Towards the end of the loop, we hear the insistent scratching sound of vinyl after the music has run out. The noise is mixed with the music and water and mixes with the glaring absence of a single recording of Bolden's own music. We are thus invited to listen to the soundtrack in discontinuous ways, while the plot animates just outside our conscious grasp, in directions that are both illusory and concrete.
Well, thanks also, Ranji, for putting. I think it's a fantastic set of disciplines. Not only is it interdisciplinary, but I really look forward to the conversation afterwards. I will keep my remarks. I'll try to keep my remarks short, mostly because they are like a provocation or challenge for a conversation between us, but also with the audience. In other words, I'm not suggesting an answer, but more like the beginning of a conversation. As a sort of title for these remarks, we could call it something like "The Precarity of Video and the Fragility of Stone." And before even going into these remarks, what I would like to point out is that as an artist, it is incredibly difficult to speak about work the more in awe you are of it. And so I've seen this piece many times. I saw it first at Prospect, and I don't know what to say. I mean, it's of course gorgeous, it's heroic, it's incredible, and we are still here gathered in conversation. But to me, the real conversation is the conversation of the artwork, the one that happens in silence. So in other words, if you can imagine all of us to be in telepathic communication while watching, Precarity, that's the conversation that I love, that art makes happen. But also these types of events, these panels are the excuse so that all of you came to see it if you hadn't seen it already. So I think that's the very important goal of this conversation. I will quote, an alternate title that for my remarks is a quote from the video itself where Buddy speaks and he says, "How does it feel to be a problem?" He says this repeatedly, right? And he's speaking about being American and a Negro, right? But like the split self, but just it's a general question to all of us. What does it feel like to be a problem? And so this is something that I think is in the various points that I want to make. The Akomfrah, I think, throughout his career has spent a huge effort and put his talent to work in the creation of this precarious archive, but that has become less precarious in the last few decades. And it's the idea of a global intellectual history of the Black diaspora, right? He has made hugely important contributions to it. And so I think, while thinking about that, I want to link Precarity and the story of Buddy Bolden to another recent work of Akomfrah, which is the Stuart Hall project that he produced in 2013. The late Stuart Hall, kind of hero to many of us. And it's also there's part of that work is this beautiful 3-channel video installation called The Unfinished Conversation. So if any of you ever get a chance to see it, hopefully some of you have, it's just incredible. And when we put these two works together, it becomes obvious that, at least in my view, they're both monuments. They're monumental. They're monumental in scope. They're monumental in tone. Several of the presentations have already pointed this out. And I think Akomfrah himself is kind of pointing at that by bringing in the section titles in the video terms like plasticity, right? It starts with fluidity, but then we get into the section called plasticity, right? And he's not talking about plastics, right? He's talking about, the tactile, the sculptural, the fine arts, this old sense of the fine art. And so I think there's also another term that is important, which is the fugitivity, the idea of the fugitive, the prisoner. I'm sitting here in this room all day, you know, and how this beautiful line of conversation where he's describing how the water goes up and up and up by the hour of the day, and by nighttime he's basically drowning, and he's one with the water. Darkness makes me one with the water, you know. So this plasticity, this that kind of these poetic sculptural images, I think are definitely at play in Akomfrah's work, even though technically speaking it's a video. And so that kind of leads me to this idea of thinking of the monument, leads me to kind of the ending question or provocation. And it has to do with, like, as an artist, I've always hated the term art world. Art world. Like when people speak, oh, the art world thinks this and the art world does that. And it just makes no sense to me. It's like the art is part of the world. How can you separate the art world from the world world? Unless we start talking about the world world, you know? And so the provocation that I'll share with you has to do with that effort of not allowing the art world to be separate from the world. And so I want to propose three kinds of monuments for this conversation. The video monument, which we just saw it, but also the Stuart Hall piece is a great example of that. There's many others in contemporary video art. And as a form, it's a troubled form because video is fleeting, right? And it's really hard to install permanently, you know? So it has these kind of traps and paradoxes as a monument. So even artists who produce in this monumental style, very beautiful, you know, we cannot think of those works technically as a proper monument, right? So let's think of that as the first proposition. Video, the precarity of video as a monument. Then we have the stone monument, which is the most conventional, right? And here, because it's very relevant to many of us, I would propose to think of Silent Sam, right? Stone, as permanent as it may seem, is also fragile and subject to history and social change. It also tells us how so many figures like Stuart Hall, you know, Buddy Bolden, do not exist in stone. Should they exist in stone? How should they exist in stone, right? We have Silent Sam and many other characters like that who are coming down these days. The third proposition is the idea of the social monument. And there I would put Maya Little, the UNC student, but also all the very brave and highly organized young activists who brought down Silent Sam, but who also the entire UNC student body who expressed very clearly the solidarity behind this action. And to me, that in itself is a monument also, right? This highly coordinated solidarity action. But we don't generally think of it as a monument. And the reason I want to bring up all three of them is because I think contemporary art allows us to mix them up, right? It gets messy at the beginning, but actually what would happen if, now that the Nasher has a big sculpture series beginning in the next few years, right? If we started commissioning artists like Akomfrah to think of themselves as sculptors, you know? What also would happen if many of the, I think, most, you know, socially engaged and politicized artists of our time actually don't know what to do with stone. It doesn't mean that they're not interested in permanence, in memory, right? In public space. So how can we together find ways to mix these three categories up, right? The video, ephemeral, you know, it's not ephemeral in terms of this piece is part of a collection. It'll be seen for many years, hopefully forever. But like they're very different modalities, and I think we've kept them too much in separate little boxes. So hopefully, in the conversation, we can figure out ways of how to mix them.
I'd like to echo my colleagues in thanking Roger for the invitation and for the curation of this event. I'm going to talk a little bit about Black genius and the precarity of the archive. There are many who will claim to have been at 1520 Cedric Avenue in the Bronx on August 11, 1973, the night that Clive Campbell, aka Kool Herc, is said to have birthed hip-hop at a house party in the community center. There's no audio recording of that night, not even a set list for what happened that night in a place mythically referred to as the birthplace of hip-hop. There similarly is no such claim to be made about a signature moment in the creation of jazz. Yet when 5-year-old Louis Armstrong snuck around the Funky Butt Hall and first heard Charles Buddy Bolden, he could only reflect that, quote, "Old Buddy Bolden blew so hard I used to wonder if I would ever have the lung power to fill one of those cornets." With Precarity, John Akomfrah's visual meditation on the life and art of Buddy Bolden, the filmmaker seeks not to recreate the moment that could mythically be referred to as a birth, nor does he seek to tell the facts of the story, but dares to provide a glimpse into the literal precarity of Black genius. Who is to care and nurture the genius for those for which citizenship and worse still humanity was thought to be at best a liminal existence? Yet to document the genius of Bolden, the one who blew so hard, is rife with that which was not documented and thus could never be documented. As Michael Ondaatje writes in Coming Through Slaughter, the experimental novel that helps inform Akomfrah's vision, quote, "There is only one photograph that exists today of Bolden and the band. As a photograph, it is not good or precise, partly because the print was found around after the fire. Existing just at the dawn of phonograph, Bolden's peak years of 1899 to 1907 began only 2 years after Thomas Edison's invention, which trademarked the gramophone. But who would waste a cutting-edge technology for one for which genius could not possibly exist?" Throughout Precarity, audiences bear witness to images of blackness, photographs rendered most pristine under the cover of water's flow, all too familiar deep rivers like the ones the Jubilee Singers turned into a Negro standard in the late 1800s. We hear Bolden voiced by Christia Udu, "I am the only thing alive, I am one with the water," and the totality of water is made apparent, yet water, flow, is also a metaphor for the non-extant archive. As Alison Nadia Fields writes in her book Uplift Cinema, quote, "Language surrounding non-extant film largely falls into 3 categories of terms, often invoked in combination: the historical artifact, the perishable organic, and the spiritual. The last category answers the perceived lack evoked by the first 2, and thereby establishes film restoration and preservation as a near-messianic solution invoked with terms such as saving and resurrection." Fields notes that responsibilities of scholars of Black film to treat non-extant films as having some of the same concerns and import as their extant counterparts if we do not look adjacently at these elements of film history, we risk missing the rich, albeit ephemeral, archive of the majority of films produced in this period. While Fields is specifically referring to early Black cinema, her observations are apropos to the non-extant archives of musical figures such as Buddy Bolden. The crisis of the non-extant archive is in part the crisis of Black genius, a genius that was obscured, ignored, disregarded in its formative moments, as the documented silence and visibility of Black genius, the lack of evidence of being seen and unheard to offer a Baldwinian mix, is used as indices of genius that was lacking in the archive. Hence, Bolden's biographer could argue that Bolden was not a genius. He attempted to follow through on the music and couldn't, which caused him great frustration and led to the public displays of rebellion against society that were his downfall and acted as a catalyst in his monumental battle with alcohol. As if Bolden simply lived in his head with the music and didn't live in a world. David Marquis writes, as if society was some innocuous force in Bolden's life and not defined by the violence, trauma associated with policing the color line. Indeed, Du Bois is echoed through Udu's Bolden, being a problem is a strange experience. Akomfrah frames precarity through 6 properties of double consciousness: fluidity, plasticity, fugitivity, enjambment, waywardness, and immanence. The film's triptych further complicating Du Bois' now flattened existentialist observations about Black life, perhaps in ways that could only be legible to the cohort of late 19th century Black Americans that Bolden belonged. As Marquis asserts of the music that would claim Bolden as its innovator, although their sound was alien to some, it had an appeal especially to a liberated post-Civil War generation of young Blacks. Yet Akomfrah's framing might very well also describe the non-extant archive. Bolden's story presumably ends in the Louisiana State Insane Asylum, where he is committed in 1907 and remained until his death 23 years later. Marquis suggested Bolden did on occasion pick up his instrument while institutionalized and quote-unquote seemingly retained traces of his old touch and mannerisms. Ondaatje offers some impression of how Bolden might have processed his new surroundings. Quote, here, where I am anonymous and alone in a white room with no history and no parading, so I can make something unknown in the shape of this room, I begin to play, back when I was unaware that reputation made the room narrower and narrower. Marquis notes, quote, that there are few aware of his former reputation. He was just another black patient who talked to himself, babbled incoherently, and walked around ritualistically touching objects. Bloody Bolden's world is a contrast to our own contemporary moment, where the overexposure of blackness finds its most logical resonance in millennial uses of social media. In this case, it was not simply about the inability for there to be a full documentation of Bolden's impact on the culture of jazz, but the underexposure and diminishing of black genius itself. Bolden would simply be one of the first of many 20th century figures for which their genius would be reduced to incoherent babble. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. I'd like to open the floor to questions. We have a little bit of time, so yes.
So I want to follow through with directly from Mark's remarks, but also reflecting on Deborah's, because it seems to me that it is quite obvious that Akomfrah is giving us commentary on the state of consciousness, in this case, a mental state. And so I was wondering if the panel could reflect on whether or not Akomfrah is indeed giving us greater insights into this issue of mental health in the 21st century, especially within the context of black males and the challenges that are faced in society, as they may have been reflected in precarity or in some larger way.
We could take 2 or 3 questions if there are more, and we'll give the panelists time to think. Sorry. So, oh yes. Sorry. Thanks.
Well, I first want to thank Professor Lash for mentioning because I came over from UNC where we were closing the Wilson at 5 because of the protest tonight. But my comment has to do with addressing this question about the interdependence, or what is the strength that is being offered. And also not to go from the sublime to the mundane about the water. And this being New Orleans, I have to think about Katrina and the survival of lots of people in that Holocaust. But I wondered about the strength as family, as Black community, because even though he mauled his mother, the images of his family, I thought, represented a certain degree of solidarity. And also the strength of time. And oddly enough, I wonder about the community, the mental institution itself, even though my first question was, I wonder how he was treated there, because it didn't seem to be segregated. And so I guess that has to do with the, I don't want to say the strength, but in his confinement, there was something protective about it that gave him the ability to endure. So I just wonder what you think about that. A lot more.
I would like to say a couple of things very quickly. I felt when Professor Lash, Professor Lash said that precarity is indeed 3 screens. How are we going to see that on Netflix? I'm going to paraphrase here. The point is that we are watching an art object, a beautiful piece, worthy of Degas, who was also in Bolden. And I saw some of those images, we call them portraits. I would call them works of art. I was actually lusting after some of those beautiful portraits as artworks that could be put in the living rooms and the homes of people. You could buy them and have them, or even better, be given them. And so my point was, I felt the solidarity with you and the public stance of having a work of art that can be shared in a big way, in a political way. The way that Professor Hart was talking about as a social movement. That's what we're all about here, a social movement. And this film has beautiful movement in the water sequences. They were outstanding, the best I've seen. They were wonderful. And in that sense, it was a wonderful piece for the Franklin Humanities water series. Thank you.
Who would like to? Deborah, yes. Yes.
The first question,
Yeah.
is to say that I think there is increasing attention to both the way that mind and body, and therefore social experience, can be imbricated in all kinds of previously misunderstood ways, like that suffering a certain predictable social oppression may trigger immune reactions. Because it is one of these strong forms of stress. There's increasing research into the degree to which the African American experience should be assessed with regard to post-traumatic stress, because most of the post-traumatic stress disorder paradigms were initially written up with regard to military experience, and yet a lot of these contexts repeat in domestic life in the U.S. for civilians. And there are also interesting ways that the symbolism that we saw in the film is being used to broach these questions. So Karen Shapiro here is doing a documentary film about John Henryism, which was a theory initiated by someone named Sherman, and
Sherman James.
Sherman James, excuse me. But at any rate, it uses the John Henry song and motif, and we saw the railroad work, the back-breaking railroad work in the installation, to describe a whole social experience that can ultimately have a strong cardiovascular effect. So it's a fruitful area.
I wanted to respond to questions 1 and 3. I'll start with question 3. To your point about the beauty of the portraits, and to Pedro's point, yes, this is not something we could watch on Netflix, but some of the stills from the film are like perfect for Instagram. In some ways, and honestly, in some ways, they're John's most Instagrammable film. In terms, I mean, you could just look at what's behind us as an example of that. But to Darrell's question, again, to think about Buddy Bolden and then bring a Bud Powell into that conversation, there are a host of other mad geniuses that we can bring into this conversation, even Kanye West, in some ways in this contemporary moment. And I was always stuck, and John doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the time necessarily in the institution, but imagining having someone like a Bud Powell or a Buddy Bolden just kind of sitting around and no one knows who they are. Right. No one recognizes what their genius is. And in some ways, that's no different than what they were experiencing outside of the institutions, right? Where whatever genius they resonated with them was not recognized in a way. There has to be something, and I think there is some value to the fact that there are no records of Buddy Bolden, because in some ways that would diminish the idea of what he was. But the fact that folks talk about him the way that there was just something about that moment. I mean, all of those early jazz performers, the recordings that we had were not how they sounded, right? Because of the difficulty of recording cylinders, and you couldn't really have percussive instruments because it would knock the cylinders off. So a lot of those recordings don't actually have percussion. So we still don't actually have a recollection of those sounds in the way that they were intended to be heard in those particular moments.
I was thinking too, and I don't know if you've seen this, Mark, but the documentary about Bad Brains, about H.R. This amazing documentary about this, and this is a singer who's alive, right? Who spent 30 years, sometimes homeless, sort of living in Baltimore, right, amongst us in a certain way, having essentially also birthed in a certain way, a certain kind of style. And I thought that was really striking, that someone could be totally, really invisible in a certain way. In over the last several decades. It's kind of a strike if you haven't seen it. The documentary is striking in that sense. So there's a way in which this does repeat itself. I think very much. It's not just a past story.
I think something trying to connect the different questions and comments. I definitely, for example, what Michael brought to us of this reading of Precarity with the film, to me makes complete sense within the social theory that I also participate in, and social movements. But to me, the artwork, Akomfrah, is almost exclusively about mental precarity, right? And not in terms of pathologized, but deep psychological, cultural precarity, through this figure of Buddy Bolden. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a very important aspect of the film. I'm not trained in psychology, so I can't tell what insights, there's some, I think that some people on the panel know a lot more about it and have said a few things. But the in a way, I think the power that is given to us in terms of your question, Michael, that what is produced by it, I do think it can be seen as an assembly of problems. That's why to me that question of what is it like to be a problem? Right, and it's a very unlikely assembly. I mean, to me,
what does it feel like to be a problem? I think there's always that kind of interesting dynamic between being a problem and feeling a problem. It's two really different things, right?
But that's, that's where I mean it. I mean, how does Silent Sand feel? He is a problem, right?
Yeah, boys.
It's a very unlikely alliance in terms of an assembly. We wouldn't put those two together in an assembly. And yet, if we think of an assembly of problems, and the precarious are a problem. Most of them feel like a problem, So, but kind of to think also of the confinement issue. I think that's a really important point. It's sometimes, I think, a bit dangerous to idealize confinement, right? For example, there's feminist, Muslim theories about how the hijab can create solidarity amongst women, right? If it's a choice, there's different theories about how many Black Panthers got their advanced studies in prison, right? And so there's so many examples in history. You can see that a population or an individual that was confined by force, to something, actually made the best of it. Right, but that's easy to it's dangerous to romanticize or idealize that. But there is, I think, a very rich poetic analogy to be made, and I apologize to the Nasher in advance for saying this, but we could kind of create an analogy between the Louisiana Insane Asylum in the video and the museum, the figure of the museum, right? Because basically museums are in museums we're allowed to do dangerous, tricky things that cannot happen in the main square, because we actually don't want these explosive things all the time, or these very frail things that would collapse. They would really fall apart. They would go to dust, And so I think that's a function of the museum that I actually really love, the confinement, but in a positive sense, not as imprisonment, but as protection, from that vulnerability.
One of the things that I thought I might just ask people to talk about on the panel is the sort of the flawlessness of the piece. I remember Shambhavi, were telling me a few months ago about bringing your class in to see the piece, a video installation class, right? And they commented on how clean everything is, right? And I was wondering if you could actually say a little bit about that. I mean, especially given the dirtiness, if you like, by contrast with the photograph. And so, run with it.
I mean, I don't know if I thought it was so clean. I think that was the students, and they had a particular context for that comment. You know, just sort of thinking about different kind of experimental cinema. This is, you know, in contrast to some that's more high budget, and but it's also pulling on certain popular culture, you know, costume drama, etc. So it's not, you know, it's not, for instance, willfully trying to be obscure.
Right.
Which you know, so can sometimes be read as cleanliness. I don't know if I would call it that. But I think that's what they were commenting on.
Right.
On noting.
Right.
That it has this kind of relationship with the popular.
Right.
Versus some kinds of video
Right.
installation.
Yes. Yes. But I was thinking about it also in terms of perspective that Deborah brought up. That there is on the one hand a kind of something disjointed in the perspective. On the other hand, there's something that is extremely refined about the way in which there is perfect sort of the close up and the distant shots are perfect, right? I mean, there's no disjointedness there, right? In the way that you have with say the multi-screen installations of some artists like Isaac Julian, for example, who's also works with in an extremely sort of highly aestheticized style, right? He plays around with that temporal disjointedness in ways that aren't quite there here. So I was wondering, Deborah, if you could maybe say something about.
Yeah, I mean, the more that you look at those disjointed frames, the more that they have a kind of allegorical precision. And so the guy that he hears when he's hallucinating, and the guy who says the insulting things, it's, well, one thing that I found fascinating about that is that the insulter, who looks much lighter skinned than the actor, actually much more closely resembles the historical depictions of what Bolden looked like and of the darkness of his skin. He's described as being very sort of light-skinned. Sorry, making a lot of sense in that connection. But it's as if there is a doubling of the relationship to this hallucinatory torment, such that these are just sort of two temporalities, two instances of movement of Buddy Bolden. And so the funky but hallucinatory kind of insult that you hear only on the left side speakers is, of course, a humorous thing, because this was part of the fame and the glory of Buddy Bolden. And so at any rate, I agree with you. It's jewel-like. What is done with movement, not only with the movement of human figures, but also with movement in photographs. When there are the photos of the band members, and the one on the far right screen, everyone is moving, and the water is moving over that image of movement. And it's just one of the most beautiful, complex representations of movement that you could imagine. So, it's just an installation of extraordinary artistry.
I think, I'm glad you bring it up, because I've actually been in the audience when young, like artists challenge Akomfrah and his generation for making this kind of work, right? And often behind it is not an objection to beauty, but a sense that the radical tradition is based in great part in challenging our expectations. And if everything is gorgeous and beautiful, we get too comfortable, And of course, that's one position that I don't think we should necessarily need to espouse. And there's very good reasons for making these impeccable works, and Akomfrah has many, right? But there is that kind of background of the radical tradition. And I think what's interesting to me about an artist like Akomfrah is that he's brought in his trajectory the whole spectrum, Like if in other visual artists, you have like someone like David Hammond and Adrian Piper doing the constant challenging, even with presenting us with really ugly things, And Akomfrah did some of this really edgy experimental stuff, and he's like, okay, now I want to do these perfect things, like these jewels, because I know how to do it. I want to show you, and also, but to produce that dignified protagonist, right? That solemn, elegant figure that we get from the film. The other thing that in terms of what Deborah brought up with perspective, that for those of you who've seen that other piece that I brought up earlier, the Unfinished Conversations, one striking difference that I noticed between these two works is that in the Stuart Hall piece, we have the triptych, we have 3-channel, but this one feels so religious in tone, because he really goes for the triptych in the religious sense.
Absolutely.
And there's so many figures where his body and the women's bodies, they really, the video screen is the frame for the human body, whereas in the Stuart Hall, that doesn't happen really. And I think that's a really, in terms of his progression for Akomfrah, it's an important.
The crimson color that suffuses the scene as we learn of his death, it made me think of Saint Teresa, and the language of being pierced by love and so on. I agree.
And it ends with a cemetery, right? Like death, right?
Okay. Well, we can take maybe one comment all the way at the back. Yes.
Joey Chamada, your formal analysis of the sorts of shots. And I was also struck by the portraiture that happens in the close-ups and how they feel less like cinematic close-ups where you get access or you project access into the psyche of the character, and more like photographs. And at that, they're also kind of doing some refusal in their. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
I feel like you said it. But I was thinking like that. In fact, I was thinking, actually, Rick, you had given an interview about Michelle Obama's portrait, and that was in my mind actually when I was when I looked at these things, just thinking about a kind of resistance to that kind of interpretation, but rather, focusing on the background, the costume, and all of these being important as a kind of performance, and a refusal to give that kind of access. So yeah, I had that in my mind because I had read that, and then when I saw this, I felt like there was something like this happening, and it's interesting to me because, of course, it's an interesting reinterpretation of cinematic uses of these similar kinds of proportion of the frame to the body, which is what it is, and because it does. I was also thinking about this discontinuous thing that you said. There's something kind of, from a film point of view, the fact that there are wide shots and there are medium close-ups, but you don't have the other shots. It does present, in my mind, a kind of discontinuous sort of space, right? But it's also not chopped up in the way that the bodies are chopped up in continuity editing, where they're really chopped up, right? It's a hand, it's a leg, it's an eye, and it's all reconstituted through editing. And here you get, the full body portrait. So, yeah. And I had one other thought about that, and it's an unworked out thought, but I was thinking it's interesting to think of these non-cinematic ways of thinking about the frame in the museum context for like a video installation. The triptych, the portrait, the tableau, all those things.
Thank you to the audience.